You stole it! Sheriff Riker's voice cut through the quiet diner as he pointed at the waitress behind the counter. The room fell silent. Coffee cups froze halfway to people's lips. Carla's hands trembled as she shook her head, insisting she had never taken anyone's wallet. But in a small town like Silver Creek, arguing with the sheriff could ruin your life, and no one dared speak. Except in the corner booth, a quiet U.S. Marine watched everything, his loyal canine sitting beside him. Suddenly the dog lifted its head, eyes fixed on something no one else had noticed. Sometimes God sends the truth in unexpected ways. And in the next few moments, that canine was about to uncover something that would shock the entire town. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this. A pale autumn sun hung over Silver Creek, Arizona, warming the quiet Main Street while a cool desert wind drifted slowly between the small storefronts. Gunnery Sergeant Michael Hayes stepped out of a dusty pickup truck and paused for a moment beside the door, letting the stillness of the town settle around him. At 42, Michael carried the unmistakable posture of a career Marine. Tall, broad-shouldered, with the controlled movements of someone trained to remain calm under pressure. His dark hair was cut short in regulation military style, touched slightly with gray near the temples, and a faint scar traced along the edge of his jawline from a training accident years earlier. His eyes were steady and observant, the kind that studied a room quietly before speaking. Friends in the Marine Corps often describe Michael as a man who rarely raised his voice, but rarely ignored something wrong. Years of service had shaped him into someone patient, disciplined, and thoughtful. But those same years had also made him cautious. He had seen enough conflict to know that most problems looked simple on the surface, but carried deeper truths beneath them. Beside him sat Atlas, a 5-year-old German Shepherd canine with a thick, amber-brown coat and alert, intelligent eyes. Atlas was large even for his breed, with powerful shoulders and a confident stance that reflected years of military training. His ears stood upright as he scanned the street with quiet attention. Atlas had worked with Michael for nearly 4 years, trained to detect explosives during joint exercises overseas. Unlike many dogs, Atlas rarely barked unnecessarily. He communicated through posture, subtle movement, and focused attention. Michael trusted those signals deeply. Over time, the two had developed an unspoken understanding that often allowed them to react faster than words could. Michael clipped the leash lightly to Atlas's harness and walked toward Miller's Diner, a modest roadside restaurant with faded red lettering painted across its front window. The bell above the door rang softly when he pushed it open. Inside, the diner smelled of strong coffee and grilled bacon. The place looked exactly the way Michael remembered it from childhood. Vinyl booths along the walls, a long counter with chrome stools, and sunlight pouring through the wide front windows. A few customers sat scattered across the room, speaking quietly over breakfast. Behind the counter stood Carla Bennett, a woman in her early 30s with shoulder-length chestnut hair loosely tied behind her neck. She was slender and slightly taller than average, with pale, freckled skin and gentle brown eyes that showed both kindness and exhaustion. Carla moved with the quick efficiency of someone who had worked in the diner for years. Life had not been easy for her. After her husband left several years earlier, she had raised her young son alone while working double shifts at the diner. That experience had made her patient with customers, even the difficult ones. Locals often described Carla as the kind of person who apologized even when something wasn't her fault. She approached Michael's booth with a warm but slightly tired smile. "Morning," she said, holding a coffee pot. "Coffee?" Michael nodded politely. "Yes, ma'am, thank you." Atlas settled quietly beneath the table, resting his head on his paws while watching the room with calm alertness. For a moment, the diner felt peaceful. Then the front door opened again. The sound of heavy boots against the tile floor, drew the attention of nearly everyone inside. Sheriff Douglas Riker entered the diner with the quiet authority of someone used to being obeyed. Riker was a large man in his early 50s, with a thick gray mustache and a square, weathered face. His uniform stretched tightly across his broad frame, and the silver star pinned to his chest caught the morning light. Years earlier, Riker had earned respect in the town as a decisive deputy who handled emergencies without hesitation. But time and unchecked authority had changed him. His reputation now was more complicated. Many residents of Silver Creek respected his position, but feared his temper. When Riker believed he was right, he rarely listened to anyone who disagreed. Two younger deputies followed him into the diner. They remained quiet, watching their sheriff closely as if waiting for instructions. Conversation in the room faded almost immediately. Riker scanned the diner with slow, deliberate eyes before focusing on Carla. "Morning," he said, though his voice carried little warmth. Carla straightened slightly, gripping the coffee pot tighter than before. "Morning, Sheriff." Riker stepped closer to the counter. "We've got a problem," he said. "One of your customers claims his wallet is missing." A middle-aged man near the counter raised his hand nervously. He was short and balding, wearing a faded plaid shirt. His name, as Michael would soon learn, was Frank Dalton, a traveling salesman who had stopped in town overnight. Frank's face looked flushed and irritated. "I had my wallet when I came in," he insisted. "Now it's gone." Carla blinked in surprise. "I haven't seen any wallet," she replied quickly. Her voice carried genuine confusion. Riker's expression hardened slightly. "Mind if we check around?" Carla hesitated, but nodded. "Of course." One of the deputies began looking around the counter, while the other scanned the nearby booths. Michael watched quietly from his seat. His instinct told him to stay out of the situation. Law enforcement matters were not his responsibility here. Still, he observed the room carefully, the same way he had during countless briefings and patrols in the Marines. Atlas shifted beneath the table. The dog's ears lifted slightly. Michael noticed the change immediately. Atlas's eyes had locked onto something across the diner. Michael followed the dog's gaze. Across the room, Frank Dalton stood beside the counter while the deputy searched nearby shelves. His body language was tense. His fingers moved nervously along the edge of his jacket pocket. Sheriff Riker turned back toward Carla. "You're the only one moving around the room this morning," he said bluntly. Carla's face paled. "Sheriff, I didn't take anything." The room had grown silent. Customers stared down at their plates. No one spoke. Michael felt a familiar tension building in the air. In the Marines, he had learned that silence like this often meant people were afraid to say what they were thinking. Atlas remained perfectly still, but his eyes had not moved. Michael leaned forward slightly, studying the room again, and suddenly he realized something. Atlas wasn't watching Carla. He was watching Frank Dalton. Michael's mind began quietly assembling the details he had observed during the past few minutes. Something about this situation didn't feel right. And Atlas, who had never once reacted without reason, seemed to think the same thing. Michael rested his hand lightly on the table, his thoughts moving carefully. Because if Atlas was focused on the man accusing Carla, then the missing wallet might not be missing at all. And the quiet town of Silver Creek might be about to discover that this morning's accusation was only the beginning of something much larger. The diner remained unusually quiet, the low hum of the coffee machine suddenly louder than the conversations that had faded moments earlier. Gunnery Sergeant Michael Hayes sat motionless in his booth near the window, his hand resting loosely on the table while his eyes followed the subtle movements unfolding across the room. He had spent years learning how to read situations without drawing attention to himself. a habit that had saved him more than once during tense training exercises and overseas deployments. Even now, dressed in civilian clothes instead of a Marine uniform, his instincts remained the same. Across the room, Sheriff Douglas Riker stood beside the counter, while one of his deputies continued searching the shelves behind Carla Bennett. Carla looked increasingly nervous, her slender hands gripping the edge of the counter, while her tired brown eyes moved anxiously between the sheriff and the confused customers seated around the diner. Michael noticed the tension in her posture, the kind that came from someone who knew she was innocent, but also understood that innocence did not always protect a person from suspicion. Under the table beside him, Atlas had not moved. Yet the large German shepherd's attention remained fixed on the same point across the room. The dog's amber eyes had narrowed slightly, his ears forward, his body perfectly still in a way that Michael recognized instantly. Atlas was alert, not aggressive, but focused with a precision that only appeared when something had triggered his trained instincts. Michael leaned forward slightly and followed the direction of the dog's gaze again. The object Atlas was watching was not Carla. It was the worn black backpack resting against the leg of Frank Dalton's chair. Frank Dalton stood near the counter, his balding head shining under the diner lights, while his fingers nervously tugged at the hem of his faded plaid shirt. Dalton was not particularly tall, barely reaching Michael's shoulder height, but his body language betrayed unease. His eyes moved frequently around the diner, as if searching for reassurance from the people nearby, though none of them seemed willing to meet his gaze. Michael had encountered many people under pressure during his years in the Marines, and he recognized the subtle difference between anger and anxiety. Dalton was not angry. He was uneasy, the way someone looked when they feared being exposed. Atlas shifted slightly beneath the table, his nose lifting a fraction, as if catching a faint scent in the air. The movement was subtle, but to Michael, it spoke clearly. Atlas had been trained to detect explosives, chemicals, and unusual materials through scent. But sometimes his reactions were triggered by behavior rather than smell alone. Michael had learned to trust those signals. Still, he remained silent. Interfering in a police matter without clear reason could create more trouble than it solved. Sheriff Riker glanced back toward Carla again. "You're telling me you haven't seen this wallet?" he asked in a voice that carried a sharp edge of impatience. Carla shook her head quickly. "No, sir." "I swear I haven't." Riker sighed loudly, clearly unconvinced. The sheriff's broad shoulders shifted beneath his uniform as he turned toward the deputy searching the counter. "Find anything?" "Not yet," the deputy replied. Michael watched the exchange with growing discomfort. Something about the sheriff's tone suggested he had already decided what the outcome should be, regardless of what the search revealed. That bothered Michael more than the accusation itself. Atlas's attention did not waver. The German shepherd's gaze remained fixed on Dalton's backpack. Michael finally reached a quiet conclusion. If Atlas believed something important was there, it deserved attention. Michael rose slowly from his booth, careful not to appear confrontational. The movement drew a few curious glances from nearby customers, but the sheriff had not yet noticed him. Atlas stood beside him immediately, his leash hanging loosely from Michael's hand as the pair stepped forward. Sheriff Riker turned when he heard the footsteps. His eyes scanned Michael quickly, lingering briefly on the Marine's confident posture, before settling into a neutral but guarded expression. "Something I can help you with?" the sheriff asked. Michael spoke calmly. "Maybe," he said. His voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to speaking clearly without raising his volume. "My dog's been staring at that backpack for the past few minutes." Riker frowned slightly. "Your dog?" Michael nodded toward Atlas. "Military canine," he said simply. "He doesn't focus on something like that without a reason." For a moment the sheriff seemed unsure how to respond. The diners around the room leaned subtly forward, curiosity replacing their earlier silence. Frank Dalton shifted uneasily beside the counter. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked defensively. Michael did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked toward the backpack. "Mind if someone checks it?" Riker hesitated, glancing between Michael and Dalton. Finally, he shrugged. "Go ahead." The younger deputy stepped forward and picked up the backpack. The zipper opened with a quiet metallic sound that seemed unusually loud in the silent diner. The deputy reached inside. For a moment, his hand searched through the contents. Then he froze. Slowly, he pulled out a brown leather wallet. The entire room seemed to stop breathing. Dalton's face drained of color. "That," he began, but the words died in his throat. Sheriff Riker stared at the wallet with narrowed eyes before taking it from the deputy's hand. He opened it quickly, checking the contents before glancing toward Dalton. "Looks like your missing wallet," the sheriff said. Dalton swallowed hard, his earlier confidence completely gone. I don't know how that got there," he stammered. The sheriff studied him for a moment longer before snapping the wallet shut and handing it back. "Maybe you dropped it yourself," Riker said dismissively. Dalton nodded quickly, clearly eager to escape further attention. "Yeah, maybe that's it." Within seconds, the tension in the diner began dissolving. Customers returned to their meals, conversations slowly restarting as if nothing unusual had happened. Carla let out a quiet breath of relief, though the nervousness had not entirely left her expression. Michael watched Sheriff Riker closely. The sheriff had barely acknowledged the discovery. There had been no apology to Carla, no attempt to clarify what had happened. Instead, Riker simply adjusted his belt and turned toward the door. "Let's go," he told the deputies. They left the diner without another word. Michael stood still for a moment, watching through the window as the sheriff's patrol vehicle pulled away. Something about the entire situation bothered him. Atlas sat calmly beside him again, his job apparently finished. Michael rested a hand briefly on the dog's head. Because while the missing wallet had been found, Sheriff Riker had seemed far more interested in blaming Carla than in discovering the truth. And that thought lingered in Michael's mind long after the patrol car disappeared down the quiet street of Silver Creek. The quiet rhythm of Silver Creek returned quickly after the incident at Miller's Diner. But for Gunnery Sergeant Michael Hayes, the town no longer felt as simple as it once had. The desert sun continued to rise over the dusty streets each morning, and the locals resumed their routines as if nothing unusual had happened. Yet Michael found himself replaying the moment in the diner over and over in his mind. The wallet had been discovered. Carla Bennett had been cleared, and Sheriff Douglas Riker had walked away without apology. On the surface, it had looked like a misunderstanding. But Michael had spent too many years studying human behavior to ignore the subtle details. What bothered him most was not Frank Dalton's nervous lie. It was the way Sheriff Riker had seemed almost disappointed when the truth surfaced. A man responsible for protecting the town should have been relieved that an innocent woman was not a thief. Instead, Riker had simply left. 3 days later, Michael stood outside Henderson Auto Repair, a small garage near the edge of town. The building was little more than a metal structure with faded paint and 2 open service bays facing the road. The smell of oil and gasoline hung in the warm afternoon air. Michael had brought his pickup truck in for a routine inspection before making the long drive back to California when his leave ended. Atlas sat calmly beside him, the large German shepherd watching the mechanics move around the garage with quiet interest. The owner of the garage was Earl Henderson, a broad man in his late 50s with a thick gray beard and permanently grease-stained hands. Earl had the rugged appearance of someone who had spent most of his life working with engines and heavy tools. His shoulders were wide, his back slightly hunched from decades of bending over car hoods, and his deep-set blue eyes carried the patient expression of a man who preferred solving mechanical problems rather than arguing with people. Earl had lived in Silver Creek nearly his entire life, and had once served briefly as a volunteer firefighter when he was younger. A knee injury from a highway accident years earlier had ended that chapter of his life, leaving him with a slight limp when he walked. Earl wiped his hands on a rag as he approached Michael's truck. "Shouldn't take long," he said in a calm voice. "Just checking the brakes." Michael nodded. "Appreciate it." Atlas sat quietly near the open bay, his ears turning slightly whenever a new sound echoed through the garage. Several passing trucks rumbled along the highway nearby. Earl glanced down at the dog with a faint smile. "That's a serious animal you've got there," he said. "Military dog?" "Explosive detection," Michael replied. Earl whistled softly. "Guess he's seen more action than this town ever will." Michael leaned against the side of the truck, watching the mechanic work. After a moment, he spoke again. "You know Sheriff Riker well?" The question made Earl pause briefly, before returning to the truck's engine. "Know him?" he repeated slowly. "Yeah, everybody in Silver Creek knows Riker." Something in his tone suggested the answer carried more weight than the words alone. Michael waited. Earl tightened a bolt beneath the hood before continuing. "Riker wasn't always the sheriff," he said. "Years ago, he was just another deputy. Different man back then. Used to talk to people like neighbors instead of suspects." "What changed?" Michael asked. Earl hesitated again, glancing toward the open road as if making sure no one else was listening. "Power," he said finally. "Power changes some people." Michael listened without interrupting. Earl leaned back from the engine bay. "Couple years ago, I got pulled over on the highway outside town," he continued. "Riker wrote me a ticket for reckless driving. Said I was doing 80 in a 50 zone. "Were you?" Michael asked. Earl snorted quietly. "My old truck can barely reach 70 downhill. But arguing with the sheriff doesn't get you far around here." Michael studied the man's expression. There was no anger in Earl's voice, only resignation. Later that afternoon, Michael walked Atlas along the town's narrow main street. The sidewalks were quiet, except for the occasional passerby greeting him politely. News traveled fast in small towns, and several people had already heard about the Marine with the canine who had helped uncover the missing wallet incident at the diner. They stopped briefly at Martinez's Grocery, a small corner store with bright produce displays in the front window. The owner, Elena Martinez, stood behind the register organizing receipts. Elena was a tall woman in her early 40s, with long black hair tied into a thick braid that hung over one shoulder. Her skin carried the warm bronze tone of someone accustomed to working outdoors in the Arizona sun. Elena had inherited the grocery store from her father nearly 10 years earlier, after he passed away unexpectedly from a heart condition. The responsibility had made her practical and cautious. She spoke politely to everyone, but rarely trusted outsiders easily. Atlas sat beside the doorway while Michael stepped inside. Elena looked up with a polite smile. "You're the Marine people have been talking about," she said. Michael raised an eyebrow slightly. "Word travels fast." "That's how towns like this work," Elena replied. Michael purchased a bottle of water and leaned casually against the counter. After a moment, he asked the same question he had asked Earl earlier. "Elena, what do you think about Sheriff Riker?" The woman's expression shifted almost instantly. The friendliness in her eyes faded slightly. "Why would you ask that?" she said carefully. Michael shrugged. "Just curious." Elena glanced toward the door before speaking again. 3 years ago, my store was robbed," she said quietly. "A teenager broke in after closing and stole several $100s from the register." "Did they catch him?" Michael asked. Yes, Elena replied. Deputies recovered most of the money. She paused. But the evidence locker report said only half of it was logged. Michael's brow tightened slightly. What happened to the rest? Elena gave a small, humorless smile. You'd have to ask Sheriff Riker. Atlas shifted slightly beside the door, his eyes watching the street. Michael left the store a few minutes later, with a growing sense that something about Silver Creek was not as peaceful as it appeared. By the time the sun began to set behind the desert hills, he had heard 2 more stories from different residents. Small incidents, each one easy to dismiss by itself. But together they formed a pattern. Michael sat on a wooden bench outside the diner that evening while Atlas rested at his feet. The Marine's thoughts moved slowly through the details he had gathered during the past few days. Unfair traffic tickets, missing evidence, people too cautious to speak openly. He had learned in the Marines that patterns often revealed truths that individual events could hide. And the pattern in Silver Creek pointed toward one man. Sheriff Douglas Riker. Michael looked down at Atlas, who lifted his head slightly, as if sensing the tension in his handler's thoughts. For the first time since returning home, Michael realized something unsettling. The incident at the diner might not have been a simple mistake. It might have been part of something much bigger. And if that was true, Silver Creek had been living with it for years. The desert evening over Silver Creek arrived slowly, the fading sunlight casting long copper shadows across the quiet streets, while a dry wind moved gently through the empty lots at the edge of town. Gunnery Sergeant Michael Hayes walked along a narrow dirt path behind the abandoned municipal building that once served as the old sheriff's office years ago. The structure stood silent now, its windows dusty and its faded paint peeling beneath the Arizona sun. Most people in Silver Creek barely noticed the place anymore. But for Michael, the quiet building had begun to carry a strange significance. The more he thought about the stories he had heard over the past few days, the more his instincts pushed him toward looking beyond the obvious. Atlas moved beside him with steady, confident steps, the large German shepherd scanning the empty area with disciplined focus. At 5 years old, the canine was in the prime of his working life, muscular, alert, and precise in his reactions. Even without the vest and identification patches he wore during military operations, Atlas still behaved like a dog on duty. Michael trusted that behavior completely. The path curved behind a line of scrub bushes and opened toward a small clearing where an old maintenance warehouse stood. The building had once been used by the town years ago for storing equipment and confiscated materials during police investigations. Now the place looked forgotten, its large metal door half rusted and hanging unevenly on its hinges. Michael had not come here with a specific plan. The walk had started as a simple way to clear his thoughts after another long day listening to quiet complaints from the townspeople. But Atlas suddenly slowed. The dog's head lifted. His nose moved slightly through the air. Michael stopped immediately. Atlas rarely behaved this way, unless something unusual had caught his attention. The German shepherd stepped forward a few paces toward the warehouse, his tail lowering slightly as he began sniffing along the ground near the entrance. Michael watched closely. The dog's movements were focused, deliberate. "Easy," Michael murmured quietly. Atlas ignored the command to pause and moved toward the side of the building where a stack of old metal containers sat partially hidden behind broken pallets. The containers looked ordinary at first glance. Industrial storage drums used for equipment or materials. But Atlas froze beside one of them. The dog sat down abruptly. Michael felt a familiar tension tighten in his chest. That was Atlas's trained signal. In the Marines, Atlas had been taught to sit whenever he detected something suspicious through scent. Michael crouched beside the container and lifted the loose lid slightly. Inside were several plastic evidence bags. Bundles of folded cash sat stacked beneath them. For a long moment, Michael simply stared. His mind moved carefully through the implications. This was not a small amount of money accidentally forgotten. The bundles were organized neatly, labeled with faded evidence tags that appeared old and partially torn. Each tag carried handwritten case numbers. Michael closed the container again slowly. Atlas watched him calmly, as if waiting for instructions. The Marine exhaled quietly. The stories he had heard in town suddenly made far more sense. Missing evidence, unexplained fines, people too afraid to question the sheriff. Michael stood up slowly, scanning the surrounding area. The clearing remained empty, the wind rustling dry grass near the warehouse walls. He knew one thing immediately. This discovery could not remain private. An hour later, Michael sat at a wooden table inside his mother's small home on the edge of town, speaking on the phone with the Arizona Department of Public Safety. The officer on the other end listened carefully as Michael explained what he had found. The man eventually introduced himself as Captain Daniel Reeves, a senior investigator for the Arizona State Police. Reeves's voice was calm and measured, carrying the steady tone of someone who had spent many years handling complicated investigations. From what Michael could tell, Reeves was probably in his late 40s, the kind of experienced officer who had learned to trust evidence more than assumptions. "Let me make sure I understand," Reeves said slowly. "You discovered sealed evidence bags and large amounts of cash stored outside official police custody?" "That's correct," Michael replied. "And you believe it may be connected to Sheriff Douglas Riker?" Michael paused briefly before answering. "I believe it deserves investigation." Reeves remained silent for several seconds. "Mr. Hayes," he said finally, "I'm going to send 2 state investigators to Silver Creek tomorrow morning. Until then, I'd recommend you stay out of sight of that location." Michael nodded, even though the officer could not see him. "That won't be a problem." The following morning, the town of Silver Creek continued its quiet routine as if nothing unusual had happened. But shortly after sunrise, 2 unmarked vehicles arrived along the highway outside town. One of the investigators who stepped out was Lieutenant Sarah Collins, a tall woman in her mid-30s with sharp green eyes and short dark hair cut neatly just above her collar. Collins carried herself with confident precision, the kind of posture developed by officers who had spent years working serious cases. Her face was calm but observant, and a faint line across her brow suggested someone who had learned early in her career that authority should be earned rather than demanded. Collins had spent much of her time in the Arizona State Police, investigating financial misconduct and evidence tampering within small departments. Her partner was investigator Mark Dalton, a tall, lean man in his early 40s with a narrow face and neatly trimmed dark beard. Dalton spoke less than Collins, but watched everything carefully. His quiet demeanor suggested patience rather than hesitation. Michael met them outside the abandoned warehouse. Atlas remained seated calmly beside him. Collins studied the German shepherd briefly before nodding. "That your partner?" Michael smiled faintly. "Something like that." When the investigators opened the metal containers, the reaction was immediate. Evidence bags filled with confiscated cash, jewelry, and small valuables lay stacked inside. Collins's expression hardened. "This doesn't belong here," she said quietly. Dalton photographed the contents carefully. Within hours, the investigators began comparing the evidence tags to old case records. Several numbers matched reports filed by Sheriff Riker's office over the past 3 years. But according to official records, those items had already been processed. Michael stood outside the warehouse while the investigators worked. Atlas sat beside him watching the road. The Marine knew the discovery would change everything in Silver Creek, because the quiet town that believed Sheriff Riker controlled the truth was about to learn how much of it had been hidden. Morning arrived over Silver Creek with a strange sense of tension in the air. as if the small desert town knew something important was about to happen. The sun rose slowly above the low Arizona hills, casting pale gold light across the quiet streets. But the usual calm rhythm of the town felt different. Word had begun to spread overnight that investigators from the Arizona State Police were asking questions. In a place as small as Silver Creek, rumors traveled faster than cars on the highway. Gunnery Sergeant Michael Hayes stood near the edge of the old warehouse clearing where the evidence containers had been discovered the previous day. He watched quietly as two marked vehicles from the Arizona State Police pulled into the dirt lot. Atlas sat beside him, the large German shepherd calm and alert, his amber-colored coat catching the morning light. The dog's posture remained relaxed but attentive, his trained instincts always quietly working in the background. Lieutenant Sarah Collins stepped out of the lead vehicle first. In daylight, she appeared even more focused than she had the day before. Her posture was straight, her sharp green eyes scanning the area carefully, while a light desert wind shifted strands of her short, dark hair. Collins carried a professional calm that came from years of investigative work. She had built a reputation inside the Arizona State Police as someone who handled difficult internal investigations without hesitation, especially cases involving misconduct inside law enforcement agencies. Behind her stepped another officer Michael had not yet met. The man introduced himself as Deputy Attorney Victor Hale, a tall, lean man in his early 50s with narrow shoulders and neatly combed silver hair. Hale wore thin rectangular glasses and carried a leather case tucked under his arm. His face had the composed seriousness of someone accustomed to courtrooms and legal proceedings. Years earlier, Hale had served as a prosecutor before moving into oversight work with the state attorney's office, specializing in corruption investigations involving public officials. His voice was quiet but deliberate, the kind that made people listen carefully. "Mr. Hayes," Hale said politely, extending his hand. Michael shook it firmly. "Lieutenant Collins explained what you discovered," Hale continued. "We're here to conduct an official inventory of the evidence containers." Michael nodded. "Everything should still be exactly where we found it." Atlas shifted slightly beside him, watching the arriving officers with quiet curiosity. Within minutes, the investigators began documenting the contents of the warehouse containers. Mark Dalton carefully photographed each bag of evidence, while Collins compared the faded case numbers to archived police records that had been retrieved overnight from the county database. The results were unsettling. Several pieces of evidence matched closed investigations handled directly by Sheriff Douglas Riker's office. Jewelry from burglary cases, cash recovered during narcotics arrests, even small valuables confiscated during routine police searches. According to official records, all of those items should have been logged, secured, and eventually transferred to the county evidence facility. But instead they had been hidden. Victor Hale closed the folder of documents in his hands slowly. "That's enough," he said quietly. Collins nodded. A short time later, 2 additional state police vehicles arrived at the sheriff's station in the center of town. Sheriff Douglas Riker stood just outside the building when the investigators approached. His broad frame filled the doorway, his thick gray mustache twitching slightly as he recognized the arriving officers. Riker had always carried himself with the confidence of a man used to being the highest authority in the room. But this time, something in the situation had shifted. Collins stepped forward calmly. "Sheriff Riker," she said, "we need to speak with you." Riker folded his arms across his chest. "About what?" Victor Hale stepped forward beside her. "About the evidence containers discovered near the old municipal warehouse." For the first time, Riker's expression changed. The silence that followed stretched across the street like a tightening wire. Several townspeople had begun gathering along the sidewalk, drawn by the sight of multiple state police vehicles. Among them stood Carla Bennett from Miller's Diner, watching with cautious curiosity. Riker's voice hardened. That warehouse hasn't been used in years, he said. Exactly, Collins replied. She handed him a printed report. These case numbers belong to investigations your office handled. Riker looked at the documents briefly, but said nothing. Victor Hale spoke next. Sheriff Riker, based on the evidence recovered, we are placing you under temporary suspension, pending a formal corruption investigation. The words seemed to echo through the quiet street. Riker's jaw tightened. You're making a mistake, he said. But the investigators had already reached their conclusion. Within minutes, Riker's service weapon and badge were collected by the state officers. The once commanding sheriff now stood silent while the investigation process officially began. Across the street, Michael watched quietly, with Atlas sitting beside him. The Marine felt no satisfaction in the moment. Justice, he knew from experience, rarely felt dramatic or triumphant. Most of the time, it simply arrived quietly after long periods of uncertainty. By late afternoon, the news had spread across the entire town. Silver Creek had lived for years under the authority of Sheriff Riker. Now, for the first time, people began speaking openly about the things they had once whispered, only in private. That evening, Michael returned to Miller's Diner before preparing to leave town the following morning. The familiar smell of coffee filled the room as he stepped inside. Carla Bennett approached his table with a grateful smile. Her brown eyes looked brighter than they had the day of the accusation. I heard what happened today, she said softly. Michael shrugged slightly. Sounds like the investigators did their job. Carla glanced down at Atlas, who sat patiently beside the booth. Well, she said gently, your dog might have helped start the whole thing. Michael reached down and scratched behind Atlas's ears. Yeah, he said quietly. He usually does. Outside the diner, the desert evening settled peacefully over Silver Creek once again. The town had not changed overnight, but something important had shifted. The silence that once protected the truth had finally been broken. Early the next morning, Michael loaded his bag into the pickup truck parked outside his mother's house. Atlas climbed into the passenger seat with familiar ease. As the engine started, Michael glanced once more down the quiet street. Silver Creek looked the same as it always had. But this time, the town had something it hadn't had in years. A chance to move forward without fear. Michael drove slowly toward the highway, the rising sun illuminating the road ahead, while Atlas watched the landscape pass quietly through the window. Behind them, Silver Creek was finally beginning to reclaim its peace. Sometimes God's miracles do not come with thunder or bright signs in the sky. Sometimes they appear quietly, through courage, through truth, and through ordinary people choosing to do what is right, even when it is difficult. Stories like this remind us that in everyday life, even one small act of integrity can bring light into places where fear once lived. If this story meant something to you, please share it with someone who might need a little hope today. Leave a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. We love hearing from this amazing community around the world. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories about courage, loyalty, and faith. May God bless you, protect your family, and fill your life with peace, strength, and unexpected miracles wherever you are watching from today.